Hi, I'm Rex Black, President of RBCS. Welcome to the RBCS YouTube channel. Hey, I hope you enjoy all these free resources that are available here. And do us one favor. We need to keep the lights on and we need your help to do that. So, when you need testing and quality related services, training, consulting, expert services, you name it, let us be one of the bidders on that next job. We don't expect to get all of your business, but we'd like to get a chance. Thanks and enjoy the shows.
On behalf of RBCS, RBCS New Zealand, and Software TestWorks, we welcome everyone today to this webinar on testing on outsourced projects. This is a 1-minute warning for the beginning of the webinar. For logistics purposes, please note that all attendee audio lines have been muted.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS New Zealand, and Software TestWorks, we welcome everyone today to this webinar on testing on outsourced projects. I am Rex Black, President of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has been both a pioneer and a leader in quality hardware and software testing. RBCS has offices in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Sri Lanka, with partners around the world. RBCS delivers insight and confidence to our clients, helping them get quality software and hardware products to market on time and with measurable return on investment. RBCS has a team of international consultants that deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. RBCS has helped hundreds of companies reduce development and support costs while assuring the best quality products are delivered to customers. I am the author of Pragmatic Software Testing, Advanced Software Testing Volumes 1 and 2, Foundations of Software Testing, Critical Testing Processes, and Managing the Testing Process. I hold a degree in Computer Science and Engineering from UCLA. I'm also past president of the International Software Testing Qualifications Board and the American Software Testing Qualifications Board. Before we start the presentation, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them through the presentation via your webinar interface. There's no need to ask for presentation copies, as the presentation is posted on the web at www.rbcs-us.com on the basic library page. If you're having problems with either the audio or visual components of this webinar, please contact GoToWebinar support. If for whatever reason you cannot get to the webinar online, or if you are dealing with an unreliable connection, please download the slides from the basic library at www.rbcs-us and be sure to use the telephone to connect rather than voice over IP, since that's more likely to be affected by a flaky internet connection. So, on with the show. Today's presentation is on testing on outsourced projects. It's based on what I and other RBCS consultants have seen and learned over the last 20-plus years of involvement in outsourced projects. I've been on all sides of the equation, from providing outsourced testing services to working for companies that were purchasing outsourced testing services to working on site with clients to help them test software bought from outsourced developers. I've seen it from a number of angles. I've also been on the hardware side, which took to outsourcing a lot earlier than the software side, and I've been on the software side quite a bit, of course, too, over the last 10 years. And I think the software side has a lot to learn from the history of outsourcing in other industries, including hardware. So some of you might be wondering what's with the onions. A lot of our clients, when they get started doing outsourcing, go through a onion peeling exercise, and by that I mean they address the problems that are immediately visible on the surface, the challenges associated with outsourcing, and they don't realize that under that layer is another layer, and under that layer is another layer, and so on and so on. And so they keep bumping into these issues as they try to successfully outsource. So what I'm going to try to help you do here is allow you to slice through the onion and see all of the different challenges that await you from a testing point of view if you're on an outsourced project. As they say, forewarned is forearmed. Now, when I'm talking about outsourcing, you might say, okay, well, what specifically do you mean by that? Basically, anytime we're sending work outside of the organization, we're outsourcing. And that can mean we're doing outsourced development, but the testing is staying in-house. We've seen that. It can mean we're doing outsourced development and the outsourcing testing as well to a single company, and I'll talk more about that later. It can mean that we're outsourcing development and outsourcing testing, but to two different companies, and again, I'll address that. And it can mean outsourcing of development and or testing to a number of companies, and we'll look at that variation too. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of bases here, and it really is the case that outsourcing has a lot of similar challenges even across these different variations. Now, another nuance related to outsourcing is how it is managed, how the engagement with the outsourced vendor or vendors is managed. It can be very hands-on, where management of the company, the purchasing company, the client, is in constant contact and supervision and guidance, control of the outsource service provider. At the other end of the extreme, we've seen things that are very, very hands-off, where it's basically just gets thrown over the wall, and people will assume that good things are going to happen, and then sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Now, in terms of location, this, of course, is another variable which has an impact on outsourcing and how it works out. It could be a company across the hall, and you know, we've seen that situation where the companies are, you know, in the same building or the same town. But then you also see situations where we're talking about cross-country or across the globe. And of course, more and more we're getting this globalized form of outsourcing that has its own set of challenges that come with it. Okay, so why is this outsourcing happening? What are the reasons for outsourcing? Well, they are varied, and they are not always fully transparent. The ones that you will hear about that people will readily acknowledge are, of course, labor and cost savings. It's going to be cheaper to do it outsourced, and it's difficult to argue that one. The wage differentials are tremendous, and it's the thing that people forget, of course, is that you're not buying an hour, you're buying an output. And we've seen some clients that don't really properly take that into account, and they assume that because it's going to cost us a tenth per hour to get the work done, that they're going to get it done 10 times cheaper, and that's not a linear relationship. Expertise, capital equipment, geographical advantages, these can also come into play, and we have seen them come into play. Certainly certain types of testing like performance testing, usability testing, and so forth. Expertise and capital equipment costs can be a big concern. So you know, we often see those come up as considerations, and publicly so. System and product certifications, certain things like, for example, getting the Windows logo stamped on your box if you're going to ship software or hardware, that there are certain labs that are allowed to do that, and that's something that drives outsourcing in some cases. And then inability to handle the work in-house. We've certainly seen situations where the clients have a big spike in their workload, and then that results in them wanting to just shuffle some work off and get it done. So those can all be drivers, and they're pretty much out in the open types of drivers. Now, there are a couple other things that are often occasionally present, possibly. I'm not going to speculate on your particular situation, but we have seen these with clients, and when they are present, they are often not publicly spoken. So we've seen situations where people feel like there's peer pressure on them. Everybody else is doing it, everybody else is outsourcing, and so we need to be doing it as well. And that's something that certainly you can see why an organization would decide to experiment with outsourcing based on that, but we've seen some fairly precipitous rushes into outsourced situations that did not appear to be driven by an appropriate level of caution, if you will. Now, another thing that we sometimes see is a level of dissatisfaction with the in-house services, that this couldn't be worse, at least it's going to be cheaper thinking. And sometimes we have actually seen this come out into the open. I remember being in a meeting once with a client, and the CIO said, I get phone calls every day from outsourcing companies that are telling me that they can do everything that you guys can do at half the cost and of higher quality, and you need to help me understand why I don't say yes to that. And there were a lot of stunned faces in the room. Now, interestingly, at some point subsequently, he actually did say yes to that. So that comment apparently did not prove adequately motivating to the people who heard it. I'm sure it was motivating to some of them to polish up their resumes. So the Gartner group of analysts, they've looked at this situation. They've pronounced outsourcing as irreversible megatrend, and I think they tend to be right, that the globalization of software industry is something that has happened and is not something which is going to be changed by much of anything. Government policies, taxation. I wouldn't expect any of those things to be silver bullets if you're on the other side of the fence saying, well, I wish that we weren't going to do this. Well, I think you have to figure out, given that it's going to happen, what you want to do. There are certainly some people that have banded together in various organizations or have just privately within their own companies become obstacles to outsourcing. I don't think that's a strategy for success for people. You could, of course, decide to do something else with your life, and we certainly saw a lot of that in 2002 when the industry went through its last big downturn, that people that were in the field just left. And I expect there's some of that might happen here during this downturn. We haven't heard as much about it yet, but maybe if the downturn persists as long as the one in 2002 does, that we'll see similar problems. So what this presentation is really about is to help you get on the train, basically. Assuming that you want to be successful in an outsourced situation, you want to try to penetrate the various mysteries, the layers of the onion that confront you, then the remainder of this presentation is about how to do that, how to go into the situation ready for success. So what are the various layers of the outsourcing onion that we're going to look at here? Well, organizing to succeed, making sure that you're properly organized. Lifecycle implications, understanding how the software development lifecycle that your organization uses interacts with the outsourcing situation. Test partners, figuring out how you're going to get the testing done of this outsourced work and whether you want to use the same company to develop and to test. Transcending the CMM, CMMI illusion, I think I could say, in the sense that the thought of, well, a company is CMMI level 5, therefore we don't have to worry about the quality and the testing. That's something that you need to get beyond because it's not that simple. Plan and execute logistics of Outsourcing, there are a lot of logistical issues, things that can happen very easily, and two people working in the same building are harder when you have to coordinate across geographical and time zone barriers. There's risk. There are a number of risks that exist that are additional to the usual risks, and so I think it's fair to say outsourcing does create additional risks for the project, and you need to manage them. Some amount of face-to-face presence is something that's very helpful, and understanding cultures, adapting to the cultures, and maintaining focus. So we'll look at each one of these in detail. Now, one of the things I want to point out as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be blunt and direct and honest about things, as I think I have a reputation for being. Now, some of the things that I say might come across as being critical of outsourcing, outsourced development, outsourced testing, CMM/CMMI, those sort of things. It's not that I'm critical of them or that I don't believe in them. Of course, RBCS provides outsourced testing services through its Software TestWorks subsidiary, so it's not at all the case that I think this stuff can't work and that it's an unmitigated disaster. But I am of the mind that if it's not managed properly, it will become a unmitigated disaster. And so what I'm trying to do and trying to convey is the important things to manage, and please don't construe that as woe is us, this stuff will never work, it's going to be a mess, a train wreck. Okay, so the first thing to think about is the need to organize. Chaos does not scale, and it will not scale up to an outsourced situation. I remember talking to a client once that was thinking about outsourcing their testing, and I advised them against it, in spite of the fact that we could very well have bid on that work. But I used the metaphor with him. I said, the only part of your testing that's really your overall test process really working right now is your test execution process. That your testers have the ability to take test cases, run them, capture the results of those tests. Everything else is pretty seriously troubled. And all of those other things are required to get you adequately organized to deal with outsourced testing. I said, the way to think of your testing right now is like a big bucket of spaghetti. It's a mess and it's chaotic, but it's pretty well contained in the bucket, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to get any worse, and it can be, the spaghetti can be straightened out strand by strand. I said, now imagine if you take that bucket and you throw that bucket 10,000 miles away over 2 oceans and 12 time zones. Now, when it lands, is it going to be more organized or less organized when all of that spaghetti goes flying out of there? Now, I'm not sure that that quite clicked with him, but I do think that is a good way of thinking about it. If your testing and your development process is pretty much a mess, but it's all, it sort of works because it's all contained within 4 walls and everybody sees each other, this day-to-day crisis intervention and firefighting and stuff that keeps the wheels on the train. Understand that will not scale. That will be a disaster if that happens. Now, this is a particular challenge if you're in an Agile world, because I think the Agile folks are still trying to figure out how to adapt to outsourced projects really well. There are some people who are doing some work on it, but there appear to be differing schools of thought about the outsource ability of Agile projects, and I don't want to speculate on that or go too far into that here. I talked about Agile challenges in the last webinar, but certainly I think if you're on a project, you're following an Agile methodology, you'd want to talk to people about how are we going to adapt these various Agile processes that we have to our outsource scenario. So remember, Agile, waterfall, V-model, whatever you're doing, you can't count on sort of chance emails, hallway discussions, individual heroics, firefighter activities by individual contributors and managers. That's not going to work because the people will not be able to notice that things are going wrong because they'll be going wrong in different time zones, potentially, certainly out of eyesight, and often out of effective email and instant messaging range because of the time zones. So understand, outsourcing is always going to increase project complexity, and anytime complexity goes up, risk goes up, and we'll look at this a little bit more later. So anytime you're dealing with a more complex project, you need to think about planning, organization, tracking, managing the execution of the project. These things become more and more important. Accidental miracles are much less likely in an outsourced scenario. Okay, now, different organizations approach things in a different way. And you might be looking at this going, well, what does that have to do with Cadillac? Well, here's what that has to do with a Cadillac. It's a Johnny Cash song here, One Piece at a Time, which some of you might have heard at one point or another. It's worth a listen if you can find it. It's about a guy who, it's a minimum wage guy working on a Cadillac assembly line, and he really wants a Cadillac, but he realizes the kind of money that he makes, he's just never going to get a Cadillac, and so, you know, union scale is not going to cut it. But he decides that he's going to get a free Cadillac by basically taking home one piece at a time. He's just going to sneak something out every day in his lunchbox, and at the end of his career there in the Cadillac assembly line, he retires and decides that he is going to put together all of the pieces, and the pieces didn't really fit together, and so he ends up with his car that's got two headlights on one side and one on the other, and it was free. It didn't cost him a dime, but it's not exactly what he thought he was going to get at the end of that process, and that definitely is something that can happen with outsourcing if you don't deal with the mapping, integrating, and standardizing tasks that will face you. You have to have approaches that mesh. So related upstream, downstream processes, any place there's a handoff or touch point, you have to look at how is that going to work. For example, when the software is to be delivered from the development organization to the test team for system testing, how is that going to work? And I mean in detail. You can't, yeah, these guys, they'll let us know when it's ready. That will not suffice. You're going to have to think about this stuff, because I have seen fairly serious crises break out when these sorts of handoffs were not properly defined, and then you went to try to execute it and it turned out to be a lot more complicated than people thought. And things that, had they been done up front, off the critical path, suddenly get on the critical path and cause significant delays in the testing. So, think about this stuff. Now, you could standardize glossaries for, terminology, look at your processes, look at your templates, tools, information, and so forth. All of this stuff, the more aligned and congruent and consistent you can get the approach in the different organizations, the better. But it's also possible to go overboard here. So, you want to think about what's the simplest thing we could do to deal with this difference in approach. Could we perhaps solve 80% of the challenges associated with the differences in approach rather simply, and then leave the other ones to deal with themselves when they come up? Or are we going to get to the point where we're going to expend more effort trying to deal with this challenge, trying to make this challenge go away, than we would if we just lived with it during the project? So do think about that. Remember, the reason to standardize these approaches is not to have standardized approaches, but to support an effective and efficient process and project. Okay, so lifecycle implications. Whatever you're doing, waterfall, V-model, Agile, Scrum, XP, RUP, whatever you're going to do, you need to make sure that the life cycle, either inherently or through effort, additional effort on your part, is adapted to allow for the distribution of work, the effective distribution of work, and the efficient distribution of work. If it's going to create more work to figure out how to distribute the work than the work that's being distributed is, then obviously you're not getting anything out of this. Now, you also want to make sure that there are checkpoints and course correction opportunities at regular, predictable, and reasonable intervals. And this, obviously you don't want to do this too frequently. Those of you who have children may have been familiar with the refrain from the back seat, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" That's not something you want to do, because then you're going to be pestering people and you're introducing additional inefficiencies and frustrations into the process. But at the same time, if you don't check frequently enough, little mistakes that could easily have been resolved, easily and cheaply been resolved had been discovered quickly, will fester into enormous problems. And by the time you discover them, the impact will be and can be very significant, and we've seen that happen with clients. So you certainly want to try to think about, well, how frequently do we want to have conference calls or virtual team meetings or something like that that allows us to have these checkpoints and make sure that we're doing the right things. Now, that has to be balanced against this third point here, the reducing of the complexity and handoffs, touch points, communications, change management, all those things. You want to make sure that you don't create some kind of overly complex process for doing checkpoints and course correction, or for any of these other coordinative activities that are going to need to happen between the client and the outsourcing organization. If you make this stuff overly complicated, you put too much overhead on it, then it's going to get less and less efficient. I think an example of that, we recently had an engagement where we were being asked to do something that was fairly high-level type of consulting, and the client insisted on tracking tasks broken down to almost like a 1 to 2 hour chunk size, and then making sure that we didn't go over on the estimated time of the tasks. And this would have been perfectly appropriate for tracking people executing a predefined set of test cases, but what we were doing was more open-ended than that. And we ended up getting in a situation where there was almost as much time spent trying to keep that tracking up to date as our needs evolved, and trying to renegotiate, rediscuss how much time was required for something as the engagement itself took. So you want to organize this stuff, but you don't want to so burden this thing, the relationship with bureaucracy, that it gets unmanageable. Okay, now let's take a look at lifecycle models and how they might affect us carving up the work as part of this coordinative role. I'm going to use the V model just because it's an easier picture to draw. The same kinds of ideas would apply in Agile. Same kind of analysis would have to be done, but we'll use the V model here, sequential model, and I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with the V model, so I'm not going to go through and explain how that works. So if you look at this, the capture of requirements and the development of acceptance tests are things that you could, and I would recommend should, retain in-house. I mean, obviously you're going to have to hand requirements off to an outsourced development team if you're going to outsource the development, and those requirements need to be reasonably well specified. Just saying, well, the classic example, I want a boat, just build me a boat. And that's anything. You can get back anything from a rowboat to the Queen Mary with that kind of requirement. You're going to need to give people more detail than that. And so you're going to keep that piece in-house. Now, the design of the system is then going to be done by the outsourced development organization. Let's assume we're outsourcing the development. And let's assume that you picked a separate organization to do the testing of what these people develop. And I'll get back into why I think that's a good idea a little bit later. So that outsourced test organization is going to, using the design and the requirements, create the integration and system tests. So that work is getting carved up. Now, outsourced development organization implements the system based on the design, and the outsourced development organization develops the component or unit tests to be run, depending on the name you prefer, and they execute those unit tests. And of course, this is happening in real time. There's actually, at the base of the V, more of a cycle that's happening here, right? It's we're iterating around, and indeed this part of the process might very well be following Agile Lifecycle and still be overall project following a V. Now, once that is done, to some extent, we can start getting the integration testing going with the outsourced test organization. And I'm leaving out the feedback loop here from this picture, but of course you would need to have a feedback loop going back and forth, between these organizations where there are bugs and new releases being handed off, and this is one of those touch point logistic kind of issues that I talked about. And once the outsourced test organization has given you the green light and hopefully found all of the defects that need to be found, they hand off to acceptance, hand off back to you for in-house acceptance test. And if this process has gone well, you should not find any bugs other than ones that maybe are environment specific. If you couldn't replicate your production environment at the outsourced test organization, or couldn't provide them access to a test lab that replicated it. Indeed, I would say that one of the KPIs, the key process indicators for success here, would be a very, very low percentage of defects detected in acceptance test, ideally 0%. Now, 0 is a very small number, a very very hard number to get to, as we know, with respect to bugs. But that should be the target. And any time a bug escapes into an acceptance test in a situation like this, that should be a cause of some analysis, root cause analysis, saying how did this happen? Not who's responsible for this happening, who we beat up, but how did this happen, and how do we change the process to try to prevent that in the future? So I just noticed that what I'm getting at there is that not only do you need to have this lifecycle model defined and the work clearly carved up in a well-defined, well-understood way, as you see in this picture, but you also need to have KPIs defined that are going to allow you to measure how successfully the process is executing. And at some point, there need to be mechanisms for instituting process improvements, and in the most extreme cases, even clawbacks from vendors if they're not delivering as promised. The vendors, in this case the outsourced test organization and the outsourced development organization, should be involved in defining what these KPIs are and what the targets for success are. Now, this slide is showing the checkpoints, project management, change management aspects of the V model. This is the same project, but showing what I was talking about before, the coordinative pieces of the puzzle, as it were. So there are some things that we'll need to do on the project management side. We will need to periodically re-review budgets and schedules, and we would do that at the end of each of these phases and make sure, okay, what needs to be adjusted. So we'd be exercising some amount of control there from a budget schedule point of view, and then we would also need to have change management in place and features, course correction, and also, of course, once you get into testing, it might even be bug triage aspects of change management. Now, change management is going to be a little different in an outsourced project than it would be in a all in-house project, because change now has financial implications. People are going to expect to get paid, basically, if their scope of work is increased, and so that means that the level of formality and so forth associated with the change management process has to be higher. Okay, now I'm going to give my pitch here for why I think you should use somebody else to do testing than the people you use for development. And of course, you say, well, that's pretty self-serving, Rex, since you run a company that in large part benefits from outsourced testing. And of course, I would love to have all of you go away from this webinar and come back and say, hey, I'd like to get a quote on some outsourced testing. That would be a great outcome from my point of view, but I recognize that is it's certainly not going to be true of all of you that you'd want that. And some of you might choose to go off and get a bid from somebody else, and well, of course, we prefer to do the business for you. I think that's preferable than if you just say, well, I'm not going to worry about this. We don't need to have any sort of independent testing, and we'll just rely on the acceptance testing when these developers hand it back to us, and they better be good enough. Well, think about what testing in the ideal case does. If you have testing fully integrated into the life cycle, it can do a lot of good gatekeeping and early warnings type of stuff. Think about a good team of testers going through a requirement specification and identifying untestable, ambiguous requirements that might or might not get the attention they deserve from the development organization. That can prevent a pretty serious train wreck, and it's not always the case that the development organization would point those out as effectively or as early as it would. Now, why not? Why couldn't an outsource development organization do this? Well, you have to have the right people with the right skills involved in testing, and this includes the management of it. And is there really a career path to foster those kind of skills and expertise within the outsourced development organization? This is a question that you have to ask. A lot of these organizations will say, oh yeah, well, we have a testing practice. Okay, but what is that really? Is it a parking lot for junior people when they come in or they have to cut their teeth? Is it a parking lot for people whose careers have stalled within the organization? Well, what's the relative training budget per year, annualized training budget per individual within that testing practice compared to a corresponding developer, right? And these are things you'd have to look at to be able to decide whether an organization was actually serious about testing or whether this was just something they kind of also had in their portfolio. You have to have equipment, tools, infrastructure, all those sort of things. It's testing can be quite an expensive endeavor. I mean, I remember working in a compatibility test lab early in my career, and we had this enormous library of hardware and software that was available for use, and that's not the kind of thing that can be easily replicated. A test team needs to be able to adapt to the project, adapt to the organization, and some of these development teams might or might not be able to, or development outsourcing companies might or might not be able to do that depending on how rigidly they adhere to something like, say, CMM or CMMI. You also have a need to get really straight facts about what the test results are. And so there's a real risk in when you let the outsourced development company do the testing as well, that editing and self-editing will occur. Now, by self-editing, what I mean is that the group of people who are testing the software that's been developed by their colleagues might choose to not report certain things or to delay the reporting of certain things in an effort to avoid embarrassing those colleagues or to avoid the career implications that might result from them embarrassing their colleagues, particularly if the testing practice, as it were, is seen as organizationally below the development practice from a totem pole type of thing, pecking order within the organization, the hierarchy. And the editing part means that unless you deal with the self-editing and you've got direct access to the test managers, there's a real good possibility that even to the extent that the test manager feels empowered to tell the straight truth, they might be having to pass that information through somebody who's called an engagement manager or something like that, who then very well might choose to water down is a strong word, but to act on things in a way that was more consistent with the interests of the outsourced development company than with the interests of the client. And that sounds like I'm saying making a serious ethical charge, but as those of you who are all of us experience in the real world know that there can be some real shades of gray there, and to the extent that you can adopt a position within that shade of gray that's more beneficial to the outsourced development company, you would expect them to do so. So, it's really risky. We see this happen. It's really risky that organizations assume that the development company that they've sent this work to can and will test competently. And by testing competently, I mean all of those things that I've just discussed. And also, another risky assumption that I mentioned before is that the acceptance testing will suffice to prevent some sort of disaster. So there's this sort of macho kind of, well, when they hand it off to us, we're going to run an acceptance test, and God help them if all those tests don't pass. I've heard that rhetoric, but I've never actually seen that action when the acceptance tests don't pass. What instead I have seen happen is a crisis mentality that, oh my God, we've got to rescue this thing. And at that point, people have too much invested in the project and oftentimes too much invested politically in the outsourcing development organization's success itself, because people have said, oh yeah, we're going to make this work, to actually take the outsource organization out over these kind of things. Say, you're fired. You did not meet the acceptance criteria. You've proven incompetent. Off you go. In some cases, the organization simply can't do that because while they might contractually have a gun to the outsourced development organization's head in the sense that they could refuse to pay or do clawbacks or something like that, the outsourced development organization, in effect, has a gun to the client's head, too, because the client needs that software and now is faced with the choice of either figuring out how to make this work in some way or another or not getting that software in the foreseeable future, which is often unacceptable. So you really put yourself into a very dangerous and untenable situation when you run those risks, because of the likelihood and impact associated with those two risks are both very high. So as I mentioned, the conflict of interest issue comes up here when you have people who are testing their own work, or maybe not testing their own work, but in charge of hiring the test partner who's going to do the work. It's the independence issue, the editing and self-editing problems, the different perspectives, the different set of assumptions. The financial incentives can be problematic in the sense that people feel that their financial incentives are best served by not finding bugs, and of course you want anybody engaged in testing to have a bug-finding mentality. Now, I'm not saying don't do acceptance testing. I was mentioning before, acceptance testing is not enough, is not going to work. Acceptance testing is necessary. You are going to have to do it, and you should do a thorough job of it. But remember that if the acceptance test fails, you're going to be faced with a number of unpalatable options. So I would say evaluate your different options in terms of independent test labs, independent testing service providers. Obviously, we provide that service, but there are a lot of others that do as well. And getting some bids on this as part of your outsourcing of development is, I think, a very good option. It'll probably result in some modest increase in the project cost and some increase in the project complexity for sure, but you're going to buy yourself a whole lot of risk mitigation with that fairly small amount of money. Okay, now the CMM/CMMI, I used the word illusion before, and I want to be clear about this. I don't mean that CMM and CMMI are not worthy things to do and that they don't ever work. We are working with a large client right now that's involved in a CMMI initiative, and you can see that it's already starting to result in some valuable thinking and changes in the way that the work is to be done. And now the thing about this particular client of ours is they are looking at CMMI as a way of improving their effectiveness and efficiency, and they will probably see great gains out of that. I think they rightly expect to see big improvements. Now, interestingly, I was at a talk a number of years ago, the ASM SM 2002 conference. So this is what I'm about to mention is something that's been known for some time. Bill Curtis was giving a keynote speech there. Bill Curtis is one of the big wigs behind the Software Engineering Institute's CMM endeavor, and he said that there are basically two kinds of organizations that are using CMM and now CMMI. So there are the organizations that are using it to increase their effectiveness and efficiency and their quality of their deliverables, and those organizations are indeed seeing those results. But there are other organizations which are using this purely as a marketing device, and for those organizations, there is not a significant quality or efficiency improvement. Now remember, this is Bill Curtis saying this. This is not somebody with outside of the SEI. This is basically an admission by one of the people who created CMM and CMMI that the system is to some extent gameable if somebody puts their mind to gaming it for financial purposes. So, well, what does that mean? Well, that means a couple things. One is that you want to take a close, hard look at an organization that is using their maturity rating as a major argument for why they should be selected as a outsourced development vendor, because the natural question then comes up, is this company one of the companies that Bill Curtis was talking about, or is this company a company that is sincere in their use of this and has actually achieved great results from it? So some amount of, say, auditing, if you will, of what's going on and how the tangible results that are available in terms of quality and efficiency that have been achieved, rather than just, oh yeah, well we have this, assessor seal of approval. And another thing to keep in mind, even if you dissatisfy yourself, yeah, they're sincere, they're seeing great results here. CMM and CMMI are not really all that rigorous in terms of testing, and so you can have a CMMI level 5 organization that, if you looked at their test maturity, would actually score pretty low. Okay, this issue of logistics. You got to get on top of the logistics, and this includes a whole bunch of stuff, the code that's being created, the supporting files, change management, all these things around the system being built. How is that going to be managed? Because obviously if that's not defined, whenever it gets tested, who knows what it is that you're actually testing, and thus who knows what the test results mean. The test system, so test environments, cohabiting software, linked up systems, databases, and so forth. And this obviously has its potential to be a major landmine here if you don't deal with this, is the databases, because if you're planning on using production data for outsourced testing, whether done by the development organization or a specific outsourced testing group or both, that can have some fairly serious security and privacy issues associated with it. And a lot of our clients are struggling with this. How do we anonymize the data for use in testing? And when we anonymize the data, does that negatively affect our ability to do system integration testing, because the links across these disparate but related data sets get broken in the anonymization process? And that's a big issue, a topic for a whole other webinar at some point or another, but certainly something that you will need to think about very carefully. Now, the test cases, the test designs, all that stuff, how is that going to get transferred back and forth? The test processes, how are those going to work? Information flows, the project documents, if you're going to do risk-based testing, how are you going to do that across the organizations? Plans and estimates, how will those be transferred back and forth? Bug reports, test status, work assignments, all of these things have to be considered up front. It's very unlikely that if you don't think about these things at all, they will just magically work themselves out the moment at which they need to. And I would say that for our organizations and clients that we work with that are running their first outsourced projects, the logistics problems are almost universal. There's a great line in the movie Body Heat, and I'm going to paraphrase here for reasons those of you who've seen the movie will relate to, where the one character is talking to another about something, a activity which is very complicated and dangerous, and he says, there are about 1,000 ways to get this wrong, and if you think of 100 of them, you're a genius. And that same kind of thing really does apply here for outsourcing. So do spend some serious time thinking about this stuff. Not that you can't avoid it, and we will have problems, but I'm saying that err on the side of overthinking about this, because most of our clients, and myself included on occasion, have underthought about this before. Okay, outsourced projects are more risky than projects that are done in-house. That's just the way it is. It's all of the usual risks will continue to exist, but you're also going to have some other risks that will get added to it. Of course, there's potentially an issue with political instability. I think you could look at that tragic situation that occurred in Mumbai and not too terribly long ago and say, wow, that's quite a scary thing. Now, of course, you also look at what happened in 2001 in New York and say, oh, that's a pretty scary thing. So it's not that there's no terrorism, political instability risks in some places and huge ones in others, but there's certainly different levels of risk, and those things can blow up fairly quickly. I think if you look at the situation of the border between the United States and Mexico, that's gotten so completely out of control because of the drug demand on the U.S. side of the equation and the gang control of drug transfers on the Mexican side of the border. That's a situation that has gotten out of control in a hurry, in part because the new Mexican president has decided that he's going to be the one that brings it under control. So, these things can be very difficult to predict. But of course, there's the stuff that you tend to think about: time zone differences, communication issues associated with having people, different parts of the world trying to communicate effectively. Infrastructure problems and inadequacies. If you've ever flown into